I now look to Ambassador Wolfowitz to continue the case for the opposition tonight.
Thank you, Madam President. It's a real privilege to be invited to debate in this historic, iconic setting. Frankly, I never expected it could be quite this entertaining, but it is. It's also somewhat intimidating. As you can already hear, I come from the other side of that great divide that separates the British and the American people, which is to say our common language. Like many Americans, myself included, I admire and envy British skill with the English language and debate. Even before we were reduced to 140 characters, or is it at 280 now? I'm not sure the number. There was nothing in American politics that compares to debate in the House of Commons. And I must say, to give our honorable opposition enormous credit, and particularly the student speaker, stunning eloquence and amazing wit. You obviously did not learn it by sitting and listening to your president speak for 3.5 hours. I hope I'm not getting you in trouble by praising you in that way. I hope sincerely that someday politicians in China will be able to speak freely the way Charles spoke tonight. I pray for that. Let me begin by quoting from a real master of the English language, even though he was not an Oxonian. He was a Sandhurst man, forgive me. Of course, I'm talking about Winston Churchill, and I'm talking about that famous episode that's been referred to a couple of times already tonight. In June of 1941, impressively, Churchill saw the German attack on Russia coming. He met with the American ambassador in London and said, if Hitler attacks Russia, the UK would go all out to help Stalin's Russia against Germany. His private secretary, John Colville, asked him afterwards, isn't that a little bit difficult for a staunch anti-communist like you to be saying that sort of thing? Churchill's reply famously was, not at all. If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. And he did almost exactly what he said, except he didn't praise Stalin at all. He spoke entirely about the Russian people, which in a way is your point. We need to think about the people, not just the regimes. We're not here debating whether it's sometimes a mistake for democracies to ally with autocracies, or whether democracies should generally do so, or whether it's better for democracies to ally with democracies. I believe democracies make our best allies and our most sustainable alliances. Unfortunately, for the proposition side, they have to argue that it's never a good thing to do, and it seems to me that the choice between Hitler and Stalin is so clear-cut. That rigid formula would not only have been a formula for national suicide for Britain, it would have meant the deaths of millions of innocent Russians. It wasn't just Palmerston and national interests, it was also a moral decision, in my opinion. There are certainly times when democracies should not ally with autocrats, but they also must, there are times when they not only must, but should do so. An example that's very close to my heart is the US alliance with South Korea. I first got involved with it as a government official when South Korea was a rather brutal dictatorship. For its 20 or so years of that alliance, the United States sustained an alliance with a dictator in South Korea, a dictatorship in South Korea, because we saw the much worse possibility if North Korea triumphed and took over the South. There's no comparison. I mean, remember, there are different kinds of dictatorships. There are better and worse ones. There is no question that North Korea was prepared to impose the worst kind of dictatorship on the South. I think alliance not only prevented that from happening, but then in 1987, it helped the South Korean people, and it was the people who did it, but there was an American finger on the scale that was very important, to force that dictators to step down and permit free elections. And one of the candidates in those free elections was a man named Kim Dae-jung, who later became I think the second or third democratically elected president in South Korea. It may surprise you to hear this. It surprises many of my American friends to hear this. But Kim Dae-jung was in danger of being executed by the dictator in 1981. But in 1980, during the transition to the Reagan administration, Reagan had his people tell the South Koreans, if you execute him, it'll be like a bolt of lightning came from the sky. They didn't know exactly how they could threaten him, but basically they were saying this alliance will be a wreck and you will be in big trouble. So the alliance with a dictator actually in that case, and I would say in other cases that I know about, like the Philippines and Taiwan, facilitated a transition to democracy. And that's something to keep in mind when one gets too principled about all of this. I do believe strongly in the principle that all people are equally entitled to the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the famous words from our anti-British declaration. Excuse me, it was not anti-British, it was against King George, not the British people. With all its imperfections, democracy is still a better form of government than any other that we know of. It's wrong and condescending, in my belief, to say that some people are incapable of democracy. I've heard that about too many people around the world: Indonesians, Koreans, Taiwanese, Chinese. Taiwan, by the way, is now, I guess, the first functioning democracy in a Chinese culture. It should be an example for the bigger country next door. And I compliment, quite sincerely, the extraordinary eloquence, especially of our Zimbabwean politician, to be able to learn to speak that way under a dictatorship. It's most impressive. But this is not a matter that can be decided simply on the basis of principle. Whether democracies should ally with autocrats depends on the concrete facts of the specific case. That requires informed judgment. It can't be based on a simple rule of thumb. I do believe, importantly, cautions. If democracies decide that they do need to ally with an autocrat, they should not be naive. Unfortunately, Roosevelt was somewhat naive dealing with Stalin. He thought one big common interest would triumph over all the conflicts of interest that turned up right away after World War II. Churchill was not so naive, but he wasn't in charge. The Americans were. Everything in our debate tonight revolves around the difference between never and sometimes. I'm on the sometimes side, they are on the never side. To be fair to them, I think they have a much harder proposition for that reason. It is a mistake to indulge autocrats when that simply helps them keep their hold on power. I think World Bank loans sometimes do that. And I think some democracies, including some African democracies, made that mistake for much too long with Robert Mugabe. So I can certainly understand Professor Mutambara's very strong feelings on that subject. However, allying with autocrats, as I just mentioned in the case of Korea, is sometimes necessary to protect them from the greater oppression of a worse dictator, and it can sometimes facilitate that transition to democracy. Allying with autocrats can sometimes lead to war or cause wars to go on longer, but sometimes it can also deter wars or prevent wars, or bring wars to a peaceful end more quickly. With China, we do sometimes need to support our Southeast Asian allies against China's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea. But at the same time, as my distinguished colleague has argued persuasively, at least to me and I hope to you, our best chance for a peaceful resolution of the dangerous crisis in Korea is to work closely with China. I even saw you nodding on that one, I believe. Even though it is a foul autocracy. Don't quote me on that, hopefully, but you will. I don't do business there. I would go one step further and tell the Chinese that if North Korea were to become an autocracy like what China was under Deng Xiaoping, to emphasize there are different kinds of autocrats. That is to say, an autocracy that doesn't threaten its neighbors, that provides a better life for its people, then great progress could be made toward resolving this crisis. And I think if the Chinese would recognize that, it would... Oh, that's one, okay. I do believe that great caution is called for when... I do believe that when democracy ally with autocracies, they should demand a price for it, in a sense. They should not make the mistake of thinking that the other side, we need it more than the other side does. I've seen that happen too often, to be honest. So, for example, when the United States is allied today in a strategic alliance, not a formal alliance, with both Egypt and Saudi Arabia against Islamic extremists, they should also be insisting on better respect for human rights in Egypt and less abusive use of force in Yemen by Saudi Arabia. You can, in fact, extract a price, as I think we did with South Korea, because, in fact, they need us more than we need them. Keep that in mind. So I do think great caution is called for when allying with autocrats. One should not be naive. But ruling out that possibility entirely, as the proposition would have us do, could endanger both democracy and peace. So I urge the House to reject this proposition.